The sky over Dover was quiet, just for a moment. It was August 1940, and the warm breeze carried only the soft rush of the wind. Below, the chalk cliffs stood like white sentinels, but high above them, something dark was circling. A pair of aircraft danced in slow spirals, two silhouettes against a canvas of clouds. One bore the black cross of the Luftwaffe. The other shimmered silver in the sunlight. Its wings stretched wide like a bird of prey. A Spitfire. On the ground, radar operators had already seen them coming. The British radar chain called Chain Home was buzzing with signals. The dots on the screens showed German aircraft sweeping across the channel. They were not bombers this time. T's were fighters. Fast, single-seater machines built for combat, not destruction. And they were heading straight for southern England. The call went out. At airfields along the coast, pilots ran for their planes. The roar of Merlin engines echoed through the hangars. Uniforms half-butt, some still pulling on gloves, they leaped into the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes. One of them was Sergeant Jeffrey Page, a young RAF pilot barely out of school. He would later recall how his heart raced, not from fear, but from the thrill. There was no time to be afraid, he wrote, only time to fly. Up above, the German Bf 109 pilot spotted Movement 3 Spitfires, climbing fast to intercept. He pushed the throttle. The Daimler-Benz engine screamed as he tried to gain the advantage. The two aircraft closed the distance in seconds, each pilot reading the other's moves like chess players at speed. A twist here, a roll, a climb, then a sharp dive. The fight had begun. The Bf 109 had power. It could climb like a rocket, but the Spitfire could turn tighter, almost on a dime. It slipped behind its German opponent like a shadow. Gun sights aligned, trigger pressed. The roar of 8 303 Browning machine guns filled the air. Tracers lit the sky, some missing, some hitting. Smoke poured from the Messerschmitt's tail as it spiraled down toward the sea. More duels erupted across the sky. In pairs or threes, they clashed and scattered like birds startled from a field. The sky over Dover became a battlefield of smoke, trails, and fire. Back at base, the radios crackled with voices. Some pilots called in kills, others never called in at all. Ground crews waited for the sound of engines returning. Every landing brought cheers or silence. That day, the Luftwaffe lost several planes. So did the RAF, but something was changing. For the first time, German pilots were not just flying past British fighters. They were meeting them head-on. And in the tight, twisting battles above the cliffs, they were learning that the Spitfire was not just a beautiful machine. It was deadly. The duel had begun. And over the white cliffs of Dover, the sky would not be quiet again for many weeks. Long before they met in the skies above Britain, the Spitfire and the Bf 109 were born from two very different dreams. Each came from a nation racing toward power, and each was designed by men who saw flight not as elegance, but as a weapon. In Britain, that dream began with a quiet engineer named Reginald Mitchell. He was not a soldier, not a general, but a designer obsessed with speed. Before war clouds even gathered, Mitchell was already shaping aluminum and rivets into something that could outfly anything on Earth. He had studied the way wind moved across wings, how drag slowed even the finest machines. His solution was bold, a thin elliptical wing that sliced through air like a blade. Every curve had purpose, every line born from precision. By the mid-1930s, the world was changing fast. Across Europe, Germany was rearming. The Nazi government poured resources into new weapons and new engines, while Mitchell's Spitfire was still being tested in secret at Supermarin's airfield. Another designer, Willy Messerschmitt, was doing the same in Augsburg. Messerschmitt's approach was ruthless. He believed in simplicity, power, and strength. The Bf 109 would not be graceful. It would be efficient. It used fewer parts than almost any other fighter of its time. Its frame was light but strong, its wings narrow to reduce drag, and its cockpit built like the inside of a steel box, tight, functional, and fast. When the Bf 109 first flew in 1935, it shocked the aviation world. It could climb higher, dive faster, and roll sharper than most military aircraft. German propaganda called it the finest fighter ever made. At air shows, the Messerschmitt left foreign observers uneasy. It was not just fast, it was a glimpse of what was coming. 2 years later, Mitchell's Spitfire took to the air. Its first flight in 1936 brought crowds to silence. Even the test pilot said it felt alive, like an extension of his own body. The Royal Air Force immediately recognized what they had, but Britain's government hesitated. Some politicians still believed old biplanes would be enough. Mitchell disagreed. He knew war was coming. He worked until his health gave out, dying in 1937 before seeing his creation go to battle. By 1939, both aircraft were ready. On one side stood the Luftwaffe, modern, organized, and armed with hundreds of Bf-109s. On the other, the RAF, still building its strength, training new pilots as quickly as they could. When Germany invaded Poland, both nations looked at their fighters not as machines, but as symbols. The Spitfire was the defender of an island. The Bf-109 was the spear of a rising empire. Neither designer would live to see what their creations would become, the two most iconic rivals ever to meet in the sky. And soon, they would test each other not in theory or on paper, but in battle. When the Spitfire and Bf-109 finally clashed, the skies above Europe became a proving ground not just for machines, but for the very ideas that built them. Every dogfight was a battle between two engineering philosophies and two visions of how to win a war in the air. The British believed in grace and maneuverability. The Spitfire's elliptical wings weren't just beautiful, they gave it unmatched agility. Pilots could roll tighter, turn faster, and stay level through sharp banks. The controls were responsive, smooth, almost delicate. A skilled pilot could make the aircraft dance through the sky, outturning anything that tried to follow. Its cockpit offered visibility in all directions. The bubble canopy and clear lines gave the RAF an edge, especially when enemies approached from above or behind. And then there was the armament. 303 Browning machine guns lined the wings, spitting fire across a wide spread that tore through enemy fuselages like paper. But the Spitfire wasn't perfect. It had weaknesses in climb, speed, and fuel range. In a long chase, it could fall behind. In vertical combat, it might lose energy. It was brilliant in a close and knife fight, but less suited to high-speed hit-and-run. The Germans designed the Bf-109 differently. It was built for raw power and quick kills. Its engine, the Daimler-Benz DB601, gave it an exceptional climb rate. German pilots often attacked from above, diving in fast, firing a short burst, and zooming away before the British could respond. The 109's armament included two nose-mounted machine guns and spiled in many variants, a 20mm cannon that fired through the propeller hub. This allowed for concentrated fire, deadly when aimed correctly. But the design had its drawbacks. The narrow landing gear made it tricky to handle on the ground, and cockpit visibility was more restricted, especially to the rear. Most importantly, the Bf-109 was short on fuel. It couldn't stay over enemy territory for long. German pilots had only minutes to engage before they had to turn back, giving the RAF an advantage as battles dragged on. British pilots learned to use their Spitfire's agility to stay inside the German turning circle, forcing the 109 into defensive climbs or dives. German pilots countered by diving to regain energy, then climbing again to strike from above. The dance became familiar. A 109 would dive onto a Spitfire's tail, fire, then pull away. The Spitfire would bank sharply, climbing into the sun or curling into a tight loop. Each pilot watched for the other to blink to make one mistake. On paper, the aircraft were close. In practice, victory often came down to who saw whom first, who reacted faster, who knew the other's strengths and flaws better. They were evenly matched in many ways, but the fight was never about statistics. It was about survival. And as the battles intensified, both sides began to understand that no amount of design could guarantee who made it home. Before the Battle of Britain turned the Channel skies into a graveyard of smoke and fire, the Spitfire and the Bf-109 had already met, briefly, violently, over France. In the spring of 1940, as Germany launched its lightning invasion across the Low Countries, the RAF scrambled to support their collapsing allies. What they found in the skies over Dunkirk shocked them. The Luftwaffe dominated the air. Squadrons of Bf-109s flew in tight formations, aggressive and confident. RAF pilots, many flying older Hurricanes, were often outnumbered and outclimbed. But when the Spitfires arrived, the Germans took notice. Fast, agile, and lethal in the right hands, the new British fighters turned heads. But they were still too few and learning to fast under fire. Pilots like Alan Deere and Richard Hillary, young and barely seasoned, wrote of those early skirmishes with a mix of fear and awe. The 109s came screaming down from altitude, loosing quick bursts and pulling away before the RF could respond. British formations were often uncoordinated, and the price was high. Dozens of aircraft were lost in minutes. Fuel was short, communication confused, and tactics still borrowed from an earlier war. On the German side, aces like Adolf Galland and Werner Maldias refined their attacks. They used altitude like a weapon, diving from the sun, their speed giving them the edge. Yet even they noticed the Spitfire's bite. Mulders noted in his combat diary that the British machines were slippery and hard to shake once engaged. The difference in turn rate was becoming clear. The skies over Dunkirk became a chaotic dance of smoke trails and spiraling engines. British pilots did what they could to protect the retreating soldiers on the beaches below, but they were forced to fight on the Germans' terms. In one account, a Spitfire pilot chased a Bf-129 through broken clouds, only to run out of ammunition. Both planes limped home, scarred but alive. This phase of the war exposed a hard truth. The RAF needed more than just good aircraft. They needed better tactics, tighter coordination, and deeper reserves of trained pilots. Losses were severe, but so were the lessons learned. By the time the last troops were lifted off the beaches of Dunkirk, the RAF knew what it was up against, and the Germans, for the first time, knew they would not own the skies without a fight. That short campaign over France set the stage for what was to come. It sharpened instincts, tested machines, and hardened young men who would soon meet again, not over the beaches, but over the fields, cities, and coastlines of England. The summer of 1940 unfolded under a sky filled with tension. For the pilots of the Royal Air Force, each morning brought the roar of engines, the crackle of radio chatter, and the knowledge that they might not live to see nightfall. It was during this time, the heart of the Battle of Britain, that young men recorded their thoughts in hurried scribbles between sorties. These personal diaries offer a raw window into the most iconic air duel in history. Spitfire versus Bf-109. Pilot officer Geoffrey Wellham, just 19 years old, wrote on July 25th, "Scrambled again today. Up before breakfast. The 109s came in hard. Got behind one, fired. Don't think I hit him. Saw my wingman go down in flames. Bloody hell, I'm still shaking." His words carried the weight of fear and the strange guilt that came with surviving. The Bf-109s had the advantage at altitude. They dove with incredible speed, attacking bombers and fighters with brutal efficiency before climbing away. Spitfire pilots learned quickly, if they let the 109s dictate the terms of the fight, they wouldn't make it back. But the British aircraft had secrets of its own. The Spitfire's tighter turn radius meant that in a close dogfight, it could often outmaneuver the Messerschmitt. Sergeant Ray Holmes, who became famous for ramming a German bomber over London, noted, "You could feel the Spitfire talk to you. She responded like a bird." The 109s were fast, but they couldn't twist with us. Every sortie brought loss. Entire squadrons were reduced to a handful of exhausted men. Yet morale never truly broke. The pilots flew on, even when friends failed to return. They joked over tea, masked their grief in silence, and stared at the sky when not in it. From the German perspective, the skies over southern England were no longer so inviting. Luftwaffe pilot Erich Hartmann would later say, "The English Spitfire was not to be underestimated. Its presence changed the way we approached every mission." Diaries captured more than tactics. They revealed how pilots watched their enemies tumble from the sky and sometimes felt nothing. Other times, they wept. Some recorded seeing parachutes blossom. Others noted the sickening thud of bodies hitting the channel. In the quiet moments, pilots scribbled notes to mothers, girlfriends, and brothers. They wrote about the smell of engine oil, the sudden lurch of G-forces, and the beauty of sunrise at 20,000 feet. The war in the air was not just fought with bullets. It was fought with memory, conscience, and the determination to hold on for one more day. These diaries did not make it into combat reports. They weren't read by high command, but they remain, decades later, as honest echoes of a sky filled with duels, dust, and the terrible beauty of war. Tactics became everything. By the middle of the Battle of Britain, both sides realized that aircraft alone wouldn't win the skies. Victory would come from how those aircraft were flown and how quickly pilots could adapt to each other's moves. Over the Channel and the green fields of southern England, this wasn't just a clash of machines. It was a duel of minds. The RAF learned early that the German Bf-109, with its fuel injection system, could dive more aggressively than the Spitfire. In a vertical plunge, it had the edge. But the Spitfire, with its elliptical wings and feather-like controls, could turn inside the 109 in tight, horizontal loops. So British pilots were trained to force the fight into turns, not dives. Squadron leader Douglas Bader despite flying with prosthetic legs, was one of the fiercest tactical innovators. He pushed for tight group flying and the controversial Finger 4 formation, which allowed greater visibility and flexibility than the rigid V-shaped formations used earlier. "Stay loose," he would say, "and keep your head on a swivel." The Luftwaffe wasn't standing still. German pilots developed what they called the bounce. A pair of Bf-109s would climb high above a formation of Spitfires and dive at speed, hoping to break the enemy's ranks before pulling out and climbing away. It was hit and run, and it worked when executed properly. But British radar changed the game. Ground controllers could vector Spitfires to intercept incoming raids with surprising accuracy. The Germans began to feel hunted, not just in the air, but even before they arrived over the coast. Tactics had to evolve quickly, or pilots would fall behind and fall out of the sky. One of the key British tactics was known simply as weaving. Pilots would zigzag as they flew, covering each other's blind spots. It was basic, almost instinctual teamwork, but it saved lives. A lone Spitfire was vulnerable. A pair working in harmony became deadly. Communication was another frontier. The British had superior radios. Spitfire pilots could talk to each other mid-fight, sharing enemy positions, requesting help, or warning of danger. German pilots, by contrast, were often flying half-blind, with weaker communication systems and tighter restrictions on talking during combat. As weeks turned into months, both sides refined their tactics. The skies became a chessboard. Only the pieces moved at 350 miles per hour and burst into flame when struck. For every successful maneuver, there was a counter. For every ace, there was a wingman, learning in real time what worked and what didn't. Every cloud, every sunbeam became part of the playbook. Dive with the sun behind you. Bank hard into the enemy's blind side. Never lose altitude unless you have the speed to escape. And behind every tactic was a face, a name, and a choice made in seconds. Live or die. Turn or dive. Fire or hold back. The Battle of Britain was not just about brave pilots. It was about clever ones. Those who studied their enemies, learned fast, and outflew death by inches. The war moved south, and so did the duel. By 1942, the skies above North Africa had become the new arena for the Spitfire and the Bf-19. This time, the sun was harsher, the sand endless, and the stakes just as high. The British 8th Army pushed westward. The German Afrika Korps fought back. And above them, the fighters danced once more. But these were no longer the same machines. The Bf-109 had evolved. New versions like the FNG series featured stronger engines, more firepower, and improved fuel systems. The Germans had learned hard lessons over Britain, and they adapted. The Bf-109 G6, nicknamed the Bulge by Allied pilots due to its prominent gun blisters, brought heavier armament to rip through tougher Allied planes. The Spitfire had changed too. In North Africa, the RAF deployed the Spitfire MKV and later MKX models with tropical filters, upgraded Merlin engines, and reinforced airframes. The agility was still there, but now the Spitfire could climb and strike faster than before, making it a match for the desert-hardened Messerschmitts. Dogfights over the sands played differently. The wide open skies of the desert meant no clouds to hide in, no hills to duck behind. Everything was exposed. Pilots often spotted each other from miles away. The element of surprise became harder to achieve, so positioning and teamwork mattered more than ever. Tactics evolved again. German pilots favored altitude and patience. They flew high, scanning for vulnerable Allied formations, then dove at blistering speeds to disrupt and disappear. British pilots had to learn fast. They began to patrol in pairs or trios, watching each other's backs constantly. Alone meant dead. Fuel was always a factor. The distances were longer. Every second in combat cost precious range. Pilots learned to fight quick and flee quicker. One German ace, Hans-Joachim Marseille, became legendary here. Nicknamed the Star of Africa, he scored over 150 kills, many in Bf-109s against Spitfires. His tactics relied on extreme maneuvering, lightning-fast shooting, and an uncanny awareness of the sky around him. But even Marseille admitted respect for the Spitfire. "The one aircraft I fear in combat," he once said, "is the one flown well." British pilots gave as good as they got. James Stocky Edwards, a Canadian ace, recalled how fighting over the desert was as much about endurance as it was about skill. "You had sand in your eyes, heat in your bones, and sweat on your stick," he said. But when you saw that Bf-109 glinting, everything else vanished. By 1943, the tide had turned. With American support, the Allies gained more aircraft, better logistics, and tighter coordination. The Spitfire began to dominate the skies, not always through raw power, but through relentless teamwork, discipline, and adaptability. And even here, thousands of miles from Dover, the old rivalry stayed alive. German and British pilots would later recall seeing each other through cockpit glass, sometimes just meters apart, both knowing this might be the last face they ever saw. Time passed, but the duel never faded. Instead, it was preserved frame by frame, round by round, in the gun camera footage that captured the raw truth of aerial combat. Mounted on the wings and fuselages of Spitfires and Bf-19s, these cameras were originally designed to confirm kills. They became silent witnesses to the most intimate moments of the war in the sky. Blurred silhouettes twisting, tracers flashing, a sudden puff of black smoke where a wing used to be. The footage didn't lie. There was no music, no narration, just cold, flickering fragments of real death and real courage. After the war, historians pored over this footage. In quiet rooms filled with film reels, they rewound and replayed the duels. Scholars from Britain, Germany, and beyond analyzed every turn, every burst of fire. They matched film to combat reports, to radio logs, to after-action interviews. They wanted to understand what really happened. Not legends, not propaganda, just the truth. They found patterns. Bf-109s diving hard and pulling vertical to escape. Spitfires rolling to their side to out-earn an enemy, trusting their wings to carry them tighter than physics allowed. They saw hesitation in some reels, a pilot choosing not to fire, and they saw ruthlessness in others' gun bursts, continuing long after the enemy was clearly falling. From this evidence came clarity. The numbers told their own story. During the height of the Battle of Britain, for every British pilot lost, the Luftwaffe lost more. The kill-to-loss ratio favored the Spitfire, especially when supported by radar and home-ground logistics. But in the early years over France, when the Germans had the edge in coordination and experience, the Bf-109 reigned. It was never one-sided. Each side had its seasons of triumph and terror. Modern flight instructors, including former military pilots, still use the gun cam footage in training today. They point to mistakes made in 1940 and 1942 as lessons in situational awareness, trigger discipline, and energy retention in turns. In many ways, the dogfights between the Spitfire and the Bf-109 became the blueprint for how to fight and how to survive. But beyond the tactics and charts, the footage revealed something else. In those silent images, you could sense the fear, the desperation, and sometimes the grace. A Bf-109 lining up a Spitfire only to break off at the last second. A Spitfire shadowing a wounded enemy plane, but not finishing it. These moments, though rare, echoed something deeper than strategy. They showed humanity inside the most brutal game of all. The footage gave the duel a kind of immortality. Young pilots studying those reels weren't just learning history, they were inheriting it. They were stepping into the same dance, where speed and instinct decided everything, and a wrong move meant falling into the sea or vanishing into a cloud of fire. And though the guns are silent now, the reels still spin. Years after the guns cooled and the skies over Europe quieted, something unexpected happened. Former enemies' men, who had once tried to kill each other in cold steel and smoke, began to meet, not in combat, but in conversation. It started with veterans reunions and history conferences. Spitfire pilots, many now with silver hair and walking sticks, sat across from Luftwaffe aces, who once flew Bf-109s with swastikas on their tails. At first, the air was thick with silence. Old pride and old pain don't vanish easily. But slowly, the ice broke. A former RAF pilot would recall a skirmish over the channel, only to have a German across the room nod in recognition he'd been there too. They traded stories, compared notes. Some even discovered they had fought the same engagement from opposite sides. What had once been a clash of nations became a shared memory, colored by time and tempered by respect. In these meetings, laughter often followed. They joked about the quirks of their machines, how the Spitfire's bubble canopy gave better visibility, but the 109's fuel-injected engine wouldn't cut out during negative G dives. They shared how both aircraft could be as deadly to their own pilots as to the enemy if pushed too hard or handled poorly. There was a quiet bond there, one that only those who had danced on the edge of death could understand. Some of these former foes even flew together again, this time in restored warbirds during air shows. Handshakes on tarmacs replaced hand signals in the sky. They posed for photographs beside the very machines that had once tried to kill them. Not everyone understood how they could forgive, but these men weren't trying to erase the past. They were trying to understand each other. More than one pilot confessed, with a glint of humility, that the man he had once feared had flown with skill and bravery. He was good, they would say, and that was the highest praise one fighter pilot could give another. But not all stories ended in reunion. Some never had the chance. Others carried scars too deep to share. Yet even in absence, there was a kind of tribute. Names remembered, letters exchanged. Sons and daughters reaching across borders to connect with the family of someone their father once faced in battle. It turned out that in the sky, where everything happened in seconds and inches, there had been room for honor. Not always, but often enough that it mattered. The duel between the Spitfire and the Bf-109 was never just about machines. It was about the people inside them. And when those people came face to face decades later, they found something war had not destroyed: respect. Would you like to proceed to part 10? Long after the last dogfight faded into history and the engines of war fell silent, the Spitfire and the Bf-109 continued to soar not through the skies, but through memory. Museums polished their wings. Documentaries replayed their confrontations. Model kits, books, and paintings kept their rivalry alive in homes around the world. These two planes had become more than aircraft. They had become symbols. For Britain, the Spitfire stood for defiance. It was the slender, graceful guardian of home soil, climbing swiftly into the clouds to meet the invader head-on. Its elliptical wings and smooth lines were the shape of hope in the darkest days of 1940. Pilots trusted it with their lives. Ground crews worked through the night to keep them flying. It wasn't just a machine, it was a lifeline. For Germany, the Bf-109 represented the cutting edge of early war aviation. Rugged, fast, and deadly in the hands of skilled pilots, it dominated the skies over Poland, France, and even early clashes over Britain. German aces scored hundreds of victories in its cockpit, using tactics honed through relentless combat. It was not elegant, but it was effective and, in the early years, feared. Yet, when these two aircraft met in the sky, their strengths and weaknesses were magnified by the men who flew them. The Spitfire had a tighter turning radius. The 109 had the climb. One relied on agility, the other on power. One protected its island, the other sought to crush resistance. The battle between them wasn't just mechanical, it was personal, cultural, even ideological. In many ways, their rivalry mirrored the war itself. Two visions of the world locked in struggle. Two designs born of different philosophies, racing toward supremacy. Two visions of the world locked in struggle. Two designs born of different philosophies, racing toward supremacy. Racing toward supremacy. And yet, they also mirrored each other, both refined over time, both flown by brave men, and both capable of extraordinary feats when pushed to the edge. Modern historians often try to crown one as superior, but the truth is more complex. Neither aircraft won alone. Neither could. Victory came through sacrifice, through innovation, through strategy, and sometimes sheer survival. But together, the Spitfire and the Bf-109 defined what air combat would mean for generations. Their legacy is not found only in wreckage, buried under fields, or in faded photographs. It lives on in every new generation that looks up and dreams of flying, in every engineer who studies their blueprints, in every veteran who hears the sound of a Merlin or Daimler-Benz engine and remembers what it meant to chase or be chased. The Spitfire and the 109 did not just fight a war, they told a story of courage, of invention, of loss and honor. And though they came from opposite sides of history, they now share the same sky, forever circling in our collective memory, never to be forgotten.